Welcome to Key Strategies to Support and Sustain Youth Staff. We are so excited you're here and very enthusiastic to be in a learning and practicing community with our partner organizations. And we trust you will take away many wins today and key strategies. And we are in the best company. We have an extraordinary speaker, Heather Kennedy, who has a PhD in social science and a master's in public health. Welcome, Heather Kennedy.
So I have to talk into the mic because they're recording this. So I know that you are probably able to hear me without the mic, but because we want to make sure online friends and that we have the ability to save this training in case you want to revisit it, share it with friends, or share it with others in the community, we're going to make that available to you. So I am so grateful and honored to be here and thankful to Mountain Youth for sponsoring this event and really inviting me into this imagination space, this sort of space of like, if I could give a training about how to better support youth staff, what would it be? So this is not a training I have given before. I developed this for you with intention to support you in not only bringing youth staff onto your team, but sustaining them so that they sort of enter what we call the pipeline or the pathway into professional services and careers that build meaning for themselves and for your communities. So, something that we developed just specifically for this space, so I'm open to as much feedback as you'd like to provide. We will try to have some movement breaks because as a person, it's hard to sort of sit for a long period of time. I know that we're perhaps begrudgingly used to Zoom, where we sit in front of one space, but now we're in physical spaces with one another. And there's going to be a mix of individual work, table work, and then large group discussion. So a mix of different modalities to hopefully keep you engaged. I also have my two movement captains over here. These gentlemen have been voluntold, but also have an option to take the out if they wish not to engage. When we need to take a movement break, they can lead us through any form of movement that they would like to see and have with their own bodies. But if they don't want to, they're going to give me the no way, ma'am, and that will also be okay. So today, I hope to describe and provide robust, concrete examples of strategies to support and sustain, retain youth staff. So in doing this and talking with the team as I developed out this presentation, right, it's one thing to be like, I know something, and quite another thing to like have it live inside your body, right, to like know what it looks like, sounds like, feels like. So I'm gonna really try hard to offer concrete ideas of what this looks like, sounds like, and feels like. And I am so grateful and honored to have worked with two youth staff who have both been youth staff at multiple different organizations to help me co-create this presentation. They also have some scenarios that they wrote up and we compensated them appropriately for this training. So just trying to model really like how do we develop something for youth staff for you so that you can support youth staff, it's really with them, right, in a really collaborative way. And so we're going to be applying those strategies. We're going to be talking about what they look like, feel like, sound like, and then we're going to apply those strategies to some scenarios and think about how they might address some of the problems and then prevent future concerns within your organization. And the very last part, right, you have to be able to put these things into action. And so I want you to be able to create an action plan for how you would like to implement the key strategies within the next week, the next month, and then within the next year. So that's sort of the map of how we plan to spend the time together. We will take a break for lunch, and and then a couple different movement breaks when I just sense that folks are feeling a little glazed over. So who am I? It's important to know why I care beyond just like these are my credentials. And I am an activist. So I have been a youth organizer for almost 20 years. I started as a young person, and I helped organize youth leadership conferences for my county in Jefferson County, Colorado. And I got involved as a 14-year-old and stayed involved, and now I'm 38. So 24-ish years in this work, which is pretty wild if you think about like what you're investing today in the youth staff that you are working with could translate into a lifelong passion for community work. So as an activist, I support young people to advocate for policies that matter to them. I don't have a particular set of policies that it has to be, but when they're passionate about something, I want to give them the tools to make the changes they most want to see. Most recently, that means that young people are working on mental health. We're working with LGBT young people in rural spaces to create more belonging. I'm working in tobacco control. And I'm trying to think of the other, well-being, perhaps more broad than just mental health. So those are some of the projects that I'm currently working on. I'm also a scholar, which that really just basically means I like to understand the impact of this work with and for young people, not just on the young people themselves, but on how it transforms adults. I think that when we have really, truly reciprocal relationships with young people, it changes who and how we are in this world, right? The way that we show up is going to be different because of our relationships with young people. And so I write in articles for journals about that. I'm a youth organizer, spoke a little bit about that, but I've been doing youth organizing since about 2006. I have a PhD in social work, a master's of public health. I'm a mother of 2 children. I have a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, 9-year-old girl named Avery and an 11-year-old boy named Clark. I identify as white, which in my work really matters because we center power and identity. Who we are and how we show up matters, and people, regardless of if I want it to or not, whether I say I have a PhD or I come in with who I am in every space. And so we have to acknowledge that in the work that I do, especially when we're talking about equity. I'm a supervisor of youth staff. I've had 4 youth staff over the time that I've been the director of the Hub for Justice-Centered Youth Engagement. So I have some working, lived experience about what it can feel like to support young people in a work environment, both the opportunities and the real challenges. And I was a young person who was a youth staff. So I was hired by the Cancer Center at 21. And I was the youngest person by 10 years on our floor. And I can remember an instance in which it was like a potluck situation, and everybody was bringing in food, and I was sitting next to this woman who I had seen in the hallways before. And she was like, "Oh, are you here visiting your mother? Is it take your daughter to work day?" And I was like, "Oh, no, I work here. They pay me." So I understand, at least from my own lived experiences, what it feels like to sort of be othered in the workplace, but I also have felt great connection to others and mentorship. So I have sort of, different perspectives. Talked a little bit about, I'm assistant professor at the Colorado School of Public Health. I feel like here's all my roles, why you should trust me. So I teach adolescent health. I teach anti-oppressive public health practice and research, and I teach the MSW, or Masters of Social Work, Masters of Public Health seminar. And then I call myself the executive dreamer of the Hub for Justice-Centered Youth Engagement. So that's who I am, and I will move on from that. So a brief overview, here's how we planned, I told you a little bit about the objectives, but here's how we sort of have broken down this workshop. I want to get to know who you are, why you showed up, and what you want to gain from this space. because ultimately I'm here to serve you and hopefully help build new knowledge or new skills or deepen existing knowledge and existing skills. So get to know you. I'll talk a little bit about Generation Z, who are the young people who are entering the workforce right now. What are some characteristics of this generation in a very asset-framed way, strengths-based way? I'll offer the key strategies. I do have, for those of you who are like, oh my gosh, I need to write everything down, I have, sorry, I know I'm not supposed to walk all the way over there. I have a handout for you at the end, but I am taught before, and I know if I hand this to you, you will only look at that. So I'm gonna give that to you later. All right, and then we're gonna really apply and spend a lot of time applying these scenarios to real life, or applying these strategies, to real life situations. That's how we're gonna do it. So we are gonna go around. I know it's gonna take a little bit of time. I planned for this to take time. I wanna know a little bit about who you are, and I hope you all wanna know about each other, right? Because y'all live in the same communities, within the same valley region, and so it's an opportunity to connect. Who are you? Your name, your pronouns, and if you're unfamiliar, you can use your name as a pronoun. So I might say, my pronouns are Heather, or you can say she, her, he, him, they, them. Or you can not share about your pronouns if you prefer. Where you work. Do you currently have youth staff? And if so, what have you really loved about that? And what is a challenge? And then what in the world can I do for you today? Other than maybe make sure you get fed, which is out of my control, but I hear there's food. And make sure that you gain something because you showed up and obviously invested a lot of your time. So what do you want to get out of this workshop? I have to be 100% honest that there is many things that I will not be able to solve in this 2-hour workshop, 2+ hour workshop. And so I can perhaps offer additional thoughts beyond what I've prepared for you all. But there certainly are challenges in terms of how to get, how to support youth staff to communicate without the last minute text. And yet, maybe some of these strategies can be applied or at least, projected onto a solution. So, and also love that folks would welcome young people to learn alongside their boss, right? Wouldn't that be a really transformative thing when we all learn together? And I was just, as y'all were talking and each of you shared, reflecting on the importance of if I had brought my youth staff and to be like, yeah, this is what really sounds like, looks like, feels like, because of the timing of this training and how we sort of put it together, it didn't feel as authentic to bring them in so quickly and in a way that didn't feel developmentally appropriate. But just to name that, I did meet with my youth staff to sort of talk about some of these ideas. So we're gonna talk a little bit about Generation Z first, and then we'll probably do a little movement break just to kind of make sure we're still awake in this space. So I did not create this visual, but I found it useful in sort of really focusing on this generation of young people who are born between 1995 and 2015. So at their youngest, 7, but many of Generation Z are truly taking a very large role in the workforce. And so they think, at least in my own experiences and from the research, they think globally about things. They, although they have their own localized experiences because of their connection to information across the globe, if I say something in a meeting, they're able to connect with that idea relatively quickly and find additional connections or information beyond that. And we'll give you these PowerPoint slides if you want to have them. We'll send those out to folks as a PDF. So happy to take all the pictures. You'll get my head in the way. However, if you would like to see these later, you will have access. And so very often we perceive that social media is a harm to young people, and that's very often the way it's framed. And yet, because of social media, young people are more likely to know about the on-the-ground experiences of other young people in Ukraine or in Uganda or really across the globe, and to be connected to and learn from one another. But because they spend a lot of time connected to the world through technology, there's often an oversized influence on their sort of understanding of the world through their social media and other media use. And so the way they understand the world is informed by the things they see, and sometimes that's out of context. So if we're saying, I want to make this much money, it may be because they've interacted with people online who, without knowing perhaps too much about how that person got to the role that they're in, that they learned that this person is making that much money, right? And so that the social media does influence their understanding of the work context, and sometimes is perhaps detached from local economies or, right, it's more about a global economy, and filter through a particular lens that they want to see, because everything is very tailored to their own interests. And so this means, and I think some of y'all spoke to it in terms of the challenges, that they demand a lot out of a supervisor. They have high expectations for what we will provide, right? And that's important. I want to be held to high standards. And I am a human being. I have funders I'm responsible to. I have my own family I'm responsible to. And so if I don't text back with a particular amount of time, right, there's that expectation, a demand for immediate response, which they might be socialized to get from others, perhaps peers within their setting. But it's important to really create, and we'll talk more about how to really meet that challenge or opportunity with them being really demanding in terms of wanting things rapidly, because their world moves very quickly, and yet systems move very slowly. And so it's important to both understand and communicate in a way that they can hear it, what the processes are. I think this eager to stand out, although they want to be recognized uniquely for their contributions. So very tailored and personalized standing out. Not just like, I want to be great, but I am great, and I want people to name what that is that I am great at. And so affirmation is really important, as is providing support for the things that need to be improved. But when they want to stand out, they want to be celebrated for what makes them unique as a person. So I love this one because it says after experiences. And they're really interested in novelty, right? What is new? What is, right, for some of us, and I was talking to the videographer today about just like every day you're like, as an adult, you're like, oh, I have to do this new thing to give this presentation I've never gave before. It's really terrifying. For many in Generation Z, not all, again, this is not a homogenous, like this is true for all people in this age group. So please, obviously there's cultural experiences that may change young people's needs, but they are after new opportunities and increasing levels of opportunity as they demonstrate capacity. And then I love this pro-social. They have a strong ethical obligation, I think, to one another, to understand the impact of their decisions. And because they're connected, they often are willing to challenge and push us all towards greater social responsibility. So an example would be in a meeting where we're talking about a vendor that we're going to buy some fanny packs from. They had decided they wanted fanny packs. And they were like, but really, we don't want to just buy something that's going to land in a landfill. Like, who is this company we're buying from? And I'm like, we don't have time for that. But, right, they're demanding that we be more intentional with our dollars. And they, in turn, are often more intentional with their own dollars. And that's a great way to really connect and to explore things together. Well, all right, so you have this idea for a fanny pack made responsibly. Tell me, like, could you come to the next meeting with 3 possibilities for how we can do that? Like, I like that suggestion. Personally, don't have time to look into it. Think it's important, and I'll put that for you to explore. All right, that's a great developmental opportunity as well. All right, a little bit more about Generation Z. I love this generation in the workforce because very often in the news media, we hear very negative things of like, they're making us work less hours. Like, I didn't really like the 50-hour work week either. They're demanding more flexibility. And really, I think, as a supervisor, flexibility is a challenge, right? But as a person, as a whole being, flexibility is good. So social connection. I think that what is important about young people is that they have experienced something that in their a very important developmental period that none of us have, or well, say you all, right? They grew up in a time when their brains and their bodies needed social connection, and they were forced into isolation. And right, so we see that like this sort of trepidation in how to have relationships, how to communicate beyond technology. And so it's important, and we'll talk about this process and what it means, but to support them in doing that or scaffold it for them so that they feel like they are prepared to go into new social situations. They desire social connection in your workplace beyond just having staff meetings, having fun together, talking about things that might be relevant in the world. They also really, because of how unpredictable things have been for this generation of young people, right? Starting from the financial crash in 2008 all the way through today when we're COVID and racial injustice and sort of a globalization of our world, they seek predictability. So I heard from these gentlemen over here about, well, I just don't even, there's so many meetings, I don't know when they are. So trying to be really consistent as much as possible, right? We think, yes, we want to be flexible and meet them where they are, and yet too much flexibility becomes a challenge and becomes hard to sort of predict when things are going to happen or when I need to be prepared. And so I've really gotten this habit of like, all right, so next week you're going to be talking about this project at staff meeting. Is there, how can I support you in doing that? So there's like predict that they will be speaking at the staff meeting next week. At least many young people, this is not true for all. I have one staff person who doesn't prefer to multitask, but often they're checking something or connecting information on their smartphone as you're sort of dialoguing with them. And we see this some from the younger millennials as well, where it's like, I don't know a thing, but there's access to knowing this thing right then. And so making space for that and creating opportunity for them to share that knowledge and creating a system where everybody feels like they're not just, I think the general assumption is like, oh, they're just on their social media. It's possible they are on social media. Or you are on social media during your meetings. I think it's interesting when we talk about young people and we're like, they're always on their phones. And then I look at my phone and my screen time and I'm like, ooh, whoops. So, and I'll sometimes be in a staff meeting and go, oh, check my email, whoops. So, right, we have to be real about like us as adults and not holding folks to different standards in terms of that, but inviting it and really leveraging their ability to connect with information in a sort of immediate way. This generation is also the most racially diverse generation ever, with almost 50% or 54% being people of color. That's really important for the workplace because when we look at leadership, it may not represent the racial diversity of the young people that we're bringing on. And maybe, creating those kinds of opportunities so that they can bring in concerns that might be associated with race or gender. Young people today are more accepting of genders outside of a binary system of male or female. And so if you do not have a space where folks can safely use the restroom based on the gender or fluidity of a gender, meaning they would prefer to use a bathroom that is a single stall, right? Just like those are some things that this generation of young people are more likely to demand from their workplaces, and if not, be critical of and feel like they don't belong. So I just put this in terms of their top issues. Right now, today, based on Pew Charitable Trust's, mental health is young people's, this is probably not a surprise, is their number one issue. The environment is number two. And then I had to put two, I could have put a fourth pillar, but I didn't find a visual that went with it. So racism and gun control happen to be, 3 and 4. And depending on which surveys you look at, they'll list one in advance of another. But I would say that young people today really want you to understand what their issues that matter to them and connect that to the work when it feels appropriate. All right. We already talked, you said less formal work experience. I didn't talk about that one, but we sort of named it, right? They're coming in, and because of the economic climate, it was less likely that young people about, let's say 8 years ago, would have had a job, right? As a teenager, it was the lowest point of youth employment since the 1970s. This is not true today in this moment. It's not the lowest points anymore, but young people are coming in with less experience. And I often actually talked to John Daly from CPR about this a little bit. He's like, well, why do you think that was? Or why are young people not wanting to work? And I was like, well, let's reframe that. Could we say that employers weren't eager to hire young people at $18 or $20 an hour when they can find other staff who are older, who have less barriers to participating, or who have more flexible schedules in their lives? So, although it may be partially true that young people were really focused on their education because they were sold this, if you don't do 14 different volunteer opportunities and 85 million hours of experience of volunteering and giving away your time, you're not going to get into college. You're not going to get into the best college. And I expect you to get into that best college. And so I think it's sort of this mix of factors, not just one thing, but I think it's a pairing of, low unemployment generally among an adult population, and therefore folks who are getting paid more to work in jobs that might have been taken by young people. And then mixed with this hyper competition market that we created as adults around what it will take to be successful. So it is true that young people are coming in with less experience and may not have had experiences of interviewing, of putting together a resume. And so it's important to think about that as a developmental opportunity for young people as they come in. I'm gonna pop it to y'all. And what about this? Or you missed this thing, or I've also heard this. Anything I'm missing from this slide? So the question is, do I think that this is sort of broadly applicable to this 2 decades time period, meaning 7-year-olds and those who are 20 entering the workforce have the same sort of needs and ways of interacting? I think similar to the millennials, those who are sort of like, oh, I'm a zennial, so I do think there's sort of I can say for young people right now who are in the workforce, so I think of those who are 16 to about 24-ish, most of this is true for folks I've interacted with. I do not know your answer to your question. I will say it's hard to imagine that this is going to be it might be even more of a swing to demanding flexibility and 30-hour work weeks and more types of comprehensive packages for wellness at a job site, right? That will even swing farther. Or maybe economics will correct it and capitalism will squash that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if another major event will happen that might influence how 7, 8, 9, 10 of my children, 11-year-olds will enter the workforce, and how the pandemic will have impacted how they show up as well. I think there's some unknowns related to that. Yeah, so the question was about how do we see follow through from Generation Z in the workplace and how it plays out, being one of two sort of poles. One being, I'll get this to you right away, and the other being, you're going to have to nag me for the next month to get this item. And so I would say I agree that because of the very fast-paced nature of young people's lives right in this moment, without structuring and scaffolding, okay, so I asked you for this paper. Let's talk through the steps it's going to take to get this paper to me. Because sometimes what I find is if they can't sign it on their phone, then they have to find a printer, wherever they're going to find that. They have to ask their parent or guardian or wherever, the library. They have to get it to their email. I mean, there's a lot of component steps to get a paper signed. Sometimes they don't have all the information they need, so then they're going to have to ask somebody. And so that feels, and I think we see this a little bit in millennials as well, like tasks that seem like everyday tasks, like getting laundry or ordering see, I'm a millennial. I order my groceries because I don't have time to walk around that store. So I think that instant, like it's either happening right away or it's not, is there's a lot of steps. And if they have easy access to the thing, printing it out, signing it on their phone, PDF viewer, bing, bang, boom, done. But if it's a task that takes 7 steps, first I have to go to the store and get printing ink, then I have to load it in the printer and find my paper and plug in my computer. That's, even though it seems like a simple task, it's important to just like attend to the fact that that task can take a lot of steps. And so I do see it even in my, sort of Zennial, like Generation Z millennial workforce. There are certain tasks like submitting papers to the university that I have to give them a very clear deadline at which if you do not submit that paper, no one is getting paid. Like I have to just lay out the terms of what not doing the activity will mean. That doesn't mean it's always going to happen. It's just a strategy that I've learned seems to work slightly better. If you do not send me this paper by Friday, then I will have to wait a month to hire you. Do you need me to print the paper and email it or send it to your house? Right? And give you an envelope to return it. Just like think about the barriers it might take for someone. Do you have the PDF signing thing on your phone? Can we download it together? I know it sounds like a lot of extra steps, but then they'll always be able to sign things on their phone, right? If you do the upstream thing, which is really about solving the problem more longitudinally, or every day you'll have 1 week in the office and then you can print items then, and I'll be there at 9 a.m. to receive your paper that you just printed. Right, so it's really about structuring it so that they can be successful. And I do think it's the smaller tasks that often become the biggest burdens, at least from my staff's experience. It's like somehow the bigger projects are easier. Yeah. Right, where I, for example, return to the office. In my workplace, my supervisor said, you will be in the office 2 days a week. I know you've liked working at home. I know you live 30 minutes from the office. Too bad, come in. So you know what I did? came in. No questions asked. I was bummed, but I went in because that's what I was told to do. My staff developed a proposal about why it is too costly in this context to come into the office. And I was like, well, I didn't hire you for a remote job, so you have to come in. And they're like, unless you give us 6% raise, we're not going to be able to come, right? And so it's important to, like, I could have gotten mad and fought them and then punished them, but it's like, I'd like a raise too. We should all get raises. So I understand, I agree with that. I do see that there's this value proposition for them, that they're weighing something that I can't connect with because I was raised in a different generation. And yet, I want them to become valuable members of my team. And so it's a both and. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think having staff and having to retrain people, there's an incredible cost. And I think for me, it's about coming into being like, okay, remember how we talked about that staff meeting being at 9 and you came in at 10:30? Can you help me understand how to support you in attending staff meeting? I don't know the answer. And they were like, can you move it to 10? I really can't wake up. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I want you to be there. And so is there flexibility? Right? I didn't say we're not going to have a staff meeting or you don't ever have to come or just come whenever you want. It was like asking the staff people to say, like, what will make this actually work for you? And not being so flexible like I'm Gumby, but being realistic about what's real for people. Yeah. I like that comment as well, right? It's a hard pill to swallow. It's real. And I like that they're able to advocate for themselves. And as a supervisor, it's hard to meet all of it all at once and still manage a budget, be responsible, to the funder. And yeah, I think about the root cause skill versus the because I said so, or you have to follow your supervisor, where it's like, okay, so every day you come late, or every day you text me at the last minute every month, whatever it is. Like, can we understand like what's really at the root of this? Do you need to start at 11? Or do you, like trying to really work with them. I agree. I have also become very flexible, but maybe that's what the supervisors of the future will be. And it's hard for us to rationalize because we might have come from a generation where, right, authority had a different meaning in our lives. And we stayed at one job for 22 years. I've been at the same place since 2006. It's just powering through. And I've, didn't learn to advocate for myself and my needs all the time, right? And so in many ways, this generation has skills that I don't even have. And so that's, as a supervisor, both a benefit and a challenge. I'm being real, like it's the streets it's hard on the streets. Right. So are there young people who are able to come at 10? Like, and finding those folks and, maybe if you get, I'm just imagining, I don't have a solution to this necessarily, but I can imagine that if a staff member, maybe the 10 to 12 time, you get an extra 50 cents an hour, because we know it's going to be harder for folks to come in during that time. And not every solution will work for, I can say one thing today and then you can try it and it doesn't work. And you're like, well, that didn't work. And I don't have the magic wand. I just have lots of both failed and successful experiences. So, yeah, I think that try one thing and then if that doesn't work, talk to each other. Like, wow, have you been successful at getting your staff here at 9? You have? What do you do? So, awesome. I'm wondering if we might take just a brief stretch break, although I know food is going to be here soonish. 10 minutes. All right. Maybe, what am I going to do? See, you have to think on your feet. Let me see what I've got next. Okay. I think I'm going to just preview the strategies because we will get a more substantial food plus stretch break, and then we'll save our if the young gentlemen want to help us in this activity in a little bit. If not, I'll lead one. I have all this. I don't have sleeves very long today, but I have long sleeves of random activities that I have. So I'll just introduce you to the 6 strategies very briefly before we go in to sort of tease up what can happen during the next couple hours together. We're going to walk through each one individually. I'm going to ask you some questions. I'll have some particular ideas under each sort of constructs, under each key strategy, and then we'll apply it to a scenario. So each one will be taken in turn. But they are. And it's interesting because it's not like I had this coming into this conversation. It was really through dialogue, both with my staff and with Mountain Youth staff of what do you think about these things? Do they sound okay? So awareness of and attending to power dynamics is my first one. As power as a sort of foundational understanding of who you are as a person, both all the identities you bring into this work, but also the sort of hierarchies within your organization. So we'll talk a little bit about each how that works and looks. Bidirectional communication. I think we talked a little bit about that instant, I want to be responded to right now. But you also have to sort of create, your own life. And, if I get texts at 11 p.m., I'm just not going to respond to them. That's my rule. I stop work and stop responding at 8 p.m. So if you want to connect with me, do then before that time. Instrumental scaffolding. We'll talk a little bit about exactly what that means. I tried to if you're an educator, this is a concept very familiar to you. But as I was learning about sort of learning theories and really how to best support folks, there's this what's called zone of proximal development, or ZPD. And essentially it's like meeting folks and understanding what they know and how they know it, and then building upon that by breaking things down into its component parts. So we'll talk a little bit about how that looks and what it might mean for the workforce. I sort of already gave an example about the form issue, but really just breaking something down into the various parts it'll take to complete the activity, understanding where their experience lies and connecting and building the skills so they could be able to complete the task successfully and then apply that learning to new scenarios or situations. Natural mentors. So this is actually, oh no, my Mac's gonna go to sleep. Sorry, I have to move. So natural mentors is actually a thing that my staff member reminded me of the importance of, because he was saying, sometimes, Heather, you're not the person I'm gonna go to. And although that may have hurt me a little bit, because I wanna be the person, I can't for every situation. Not only because of my own identities, but because of my availability. Sometimes I cannot have a meeting for 2 hours to debrief something, but hopefully someone on my team may. So natural mentors is a way to create sort of levels within your organization so that they have multiple people they can go to for different forms of support. Right? And that's really led by them and their own needs, not you and your needs. Equity and justice. We'll talk more about what this means in the context of supervision, but I couldn't do a presentation without adding equity and justice. And there's lots of different ways I see this showing up for youth staff. Because they are the most racially diverse generation, they're young people who are more likely to be gender diverse. And so thinking of that in addition to how to create equity among your team. And then finally, reflection and action. That we are going to learn things that do and do not work. And we have to sort of have a mirror so that we're constantly looking and going, okay, well, what about this is about me? And what is it about our organization? And what from this scenario is about the individual youth employee? And like trying to tease that out and reflect individually as a person and then as a staff and in dialogue in that sort of dyad as well. So we'll talk a little bit about the reflection and then how to take action based on that as well. So now we're going to start digging into each of these 6 key strategies. And we're going to start with awareness of and attending to power dynamics. So this is audience participation because, it's important to do. So when I say power dynamics, what might that mean in this particular context? If I'm saying attending to an awareness of power dynamics, what do y'all think that might mean? Intimidation, okay. Perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, that sort of thing, okay. The structure of our leadership, they said I had to repeat so they could hear. So in case you just, so right, thinking about the hierarchy, or even if you don't call it a hierarchy, the structure within your organization, individual relationships with folks. Anything else? Power dynamics. So right, power is always operating. Sometimes it can be power over, meaning I have power over whether you get a job. I have power to decide what your work hours are, whether or not you adhere to those. That's neither here nor there. So power dynamics are always operating, even in this physical space. Each person, as they said, their role. We hold our different identities in terms of our gender, our race, racial identity, our class, the education we bring into the spaces that we're operating in, and then sort of the way that power is distributed within your organization, meaning who has power to control others within an organization. And so if I am I am a white woman, and that means particular things for my staff who are gender expansive people of color who are from a native tribe in Nebraska, for example. So that brings in certain kinds of power. Whether I identify as white racial identity. And then I'm also that person's supervisor. And we're in a university which values certain types of education over others. And your role that you can have really largely depends on the kinds of education that you have. And so, right, there's just lots of different dynamics. The length of employment, how long someone has been there, might make them feel powerful or powerless in a given situation. And so you already started to name, and I named a couple, but what are some of the different kinds of power dynamics that you see in your organization? So the question is, what kinds of power dynamics are at play in your organization? Okay, so your employees have a lot of power because of the economic context, and you need them to run your center. Okay. What other kinds of power might be at play at your organizations? So there's some age-based hierarchies created within your leadership where the executives or leaders are in their 40s or above. Folks in the middle are 30s and late 20s, and then you have your youth staff. And so that really bifurcated or created a sort of a distinct categories based on age. Okay? So having so much knowledge about a particular process that's core to the organization, right? Because everybody has knowledge of some kind, deep, based on their own experience, but you're saying a particular type of knowledge that makes them be someone that is able to understand the organization well, make decisions, etc. Yeah? Okay. So you have some groupings, right? And so we call that collective power in a positive asset frame way, but can be a challenge when you have a group of friends who are all leaving at the same times to vacation or be with one another. Okay? Any other forms of power you see playing out? Gender dynamics or racial dynamics? Not so much. Some? So bilingual staff at your organization get compensated a higher rate? So your organization is mostly female, but because you're in an industry that has typically or has sort of been defined as a more male-dominated industry, is that how you describe that? Okay. So how does that generate power? What kind of power dynamics do you feel like then that introduces? So different hiring requirements for male applicants, like there's lower expectations? Okay, interesting. Thank you. Because a particular activity has been sort of socialized as being associated more often with a particular gender, males in this case. Okay. Any other? Okay. So some cute little visuals for you. I think can be really powerful when you make the felt or implicit explicit, meaning you're really talking about who those people are, what is their gender, their race, to the degree to which that's appropriate for the context. And I guess the unstated assumption then is that you have some general understanding of who you are as a person and how that might impact how others respond to you and the kind of power you might be afforded just because of your status at your organization and your own race, gender, class background. So in our work, we talk about who they are and why that might matter and what unique perspectives that they might bring that is different from my own. And while neither invalidates one another, it's important that we can listen carefully. So we discuss identity and how it might relate to whatever decision is being made. And sometimes that looks like, for me, we were trying to decide whether or not to do something called a land acknowledgement in the start of a training. And a land acknowledgement is essentially a practice of which has been taken up by universities largely, of naming the native people whose land has been stolen and then given, and that we're on today. And so one of my staff members is from a tribe in Nebraska, and we really wanted to make sure that they were a critical part of the conversation, but not feeling like we were going to rely solely on their input or perspective, so that they were like not the sole representative of all native people, knowing that there are more than 500 native tribes, indigenous tribes in the United States, right? So we're not saying you are the representative, stand for all native humans, but honoring that understanding and allowing that space to provide us the feedback when it felt appropriate. So I think this one seems really simple. For me, as a supervisor, I acknowledge that I am often going to make mistakes, and it is important for me to attend to and acknowledge when I do, and account for any unintended harm that I might have caused. So apologize when you make mistakes. That very often supervisors, it's the assumption of, even if I made a mistake, I'm the supervisor, and yet that does create that hierarchy between the young people and yourself, which can push young folks in the workforce away. And so I'm trying to draw up a concrete example of a time when I had to apologize. So very recently, and there's a scenario that comes up later about this, but my youth staff member was at a meeting, and their gender was assumed. And they assumed that in the meeting, it was mostly female-identified folks, and my staff member identifies as transgender male. And so they were like, well, since there's no men here, as one of the participants made a statement, like, there's not any men here, so we really need to get some more men at this meeting. And my staff member felt like that had personally impacted them. And as I was reflecting with my youth staff member about their experience in that meeting, I had to acknowledge that, in part, I didn't know what that meeting was. They were going to. They were invited to attend. I didn't know who was going to be there, and not that you can protect all people from experiencing what is called a microaggression, or something that feels invalidating because of their racial identity, their gender identity. In this case, his indigenous identity, because he had long hair and wore it in a ponytail. And so, right, it's like trying to figure out, well, what of this can I own? What part of this scenario is in part because I didn't know enough, or I didn't do enough to kind of understand the context before I sent you in there. And so I have heard from many youth advisors of, like, I was sent into that meeting and then I was called on to be the sole speaker for all young people, right? And that is in some ways a fault of the supervisor for not knowing enough about the context of the meeting before sending young people in, or not preparing young people to be the representative if they are going to have to be one. Sometimes we do need young people to represent us in our organization and be a voice for young people. But if we don't set them up for success, we might need to apologize when we make that mistake. I also find that more broadly in youth volunteering as well. Sometimes I just forget to describe something well, or I forget to give folks a break, or just things that I do that I try to account for, which levels some of the power dynamics. And then because youth staff, and we were talking over here, youth staff work between 4 and 12 hours a week. Sometimes they work as many as 20, or in your case, maybe they're working a full-time job. But they can't be in all the meetings, and there's often times we're going to have to make decisions without the youth staff, especially if you're a youth-directed organization, or an organization that's really vision, mission, values surround serving and working with young people. That it can be inconsistent when we're like, we're committed to hearing young people's voices, and yet we have to make decisions on a day-to-day basis where their voices can't be included because the meeting happened and they weren't working or they weren't available. So if you're making a constant decision that impacts the youth staff that you have, and it's a decision that feels like it could be made in partnership, it's important to justify why that decision has been made. We made the staff meeting at 9 because that's the time when everybody can attend, or when everybody's starting their workday. It really sets us up for success. That's a decision I had to make for our entire team, but this is why we have that decision. We were just talking a lot about meetings and folks not being able to attend on time. Or our work hours are 9 to 5 because that's when our clients need to be served. And this is our client population, and this is the work hours. So if there is a decision that is made, it is important to give some context, not just because I said so. Because I will say Generation Z is not, doesn't accept because I said so as easily as other generations have. All right, here's a real life scenario. I'm gonna ask, what would you do, or what do you see happening here? You just held an all staff meeting in which all of your staff attended, including your youth staff. One of the more senior members of the team mentions to you at the meeting that youth staff need to speak and dress more maturely. What might you do? Go ahead and think for a minute or two. So you would reference your employee handbook and make sure that they know about that as for the adult staff or for the youth staff? Okay, so educating the adult staff on our norms and expectations. Okay. It's really like level setting with adults of like, we have a handbook. This is what it says. They're doing that. They're showing up as their authentic selves. Any other thoughts? So I heard you say that it's important to reinforce whatever is in the handbook and invite youth staff to make recommendations for adjustments based on their needs so they can show up fully, but that it is also important to have a degree of professionalism as it relates to the work space you're creating. Okay. Yeah, so I think that you named at least 3 things that were really important. One is modeling. As a supervisor, right, we also want to make sure that whatever the dress code is, that we're following along and that all members of the team are doing that. And I heard setting expectations early on and being clear about what those are. And then I heard sort of talking about it soon versus letting something sort of continue. So intervening quickly and briefly. You didn't go on like, and then I gave a 45-minute presentation about the importance of dress code, right? It's just intervening quickly and referring back to the stated material. Right, that's a really good point. Because I hired a bunch of youth staff at Children's Hospital where I used to work, and they were interns for a 10-week summer apprenticeship. And we had our goal was to increase diversity of clinical behavioral health careers. And in doing that, it meant that the folks that we were trying to recruit were those young people who may not have had a professional career before in a work setting, who may not have the financial means to buy new clothing, or had a cultural way of dress that perhaps felt inconsistent with the traditional dress of the other professionals in the setting. And so we really had to dig into, for each person, like sort of what they needed in order to be able to dress most appropriately for that work site. And similarly, we didn't have different standards for our professionals and our youth staff because everyone was patient-facing, meaning they were interacting with patients at the hospital and representing the brand. But it's important to really understand sort of what is at the root or reason why they're dressing in a particular way and what they need to be able to dress in a way that is consistent with professional attire. So, and I love what you said as well, Chris, because it's important to then sort of get on the same page in terms of like the level setting. This is what we have in our policy. So even though you may not like it, this is what the policy says, but on both sides, both the youth staff side and the adult side. Now, the speaking more maturely thing is also really interesting. We talked a lot about dress code. Any thoughts on they need to speak more maturely? Yeah. So I really liked what you said in terms of connecting with that individual and exhibiting caring for them being understood as a valued member of your community. And not projecting into the future of like, if you keep doing this, no one's going to respect you, but really like at that moment, providing really specific feedback about how the language they're using is impacting the work in that like sort of present moment. I think it's important to do it at a very individual level versus a sort of more paternalistic, if you do this, no one, I don't know, we're going to kick you out or you'll be fired or in the future you'll never get another job, right? Just really exhibiting caring, which I think you highlighted in your example. Really trying to understand. So this young person that we hired, her body had changed pretty significantly between the clothes she had and the body she had. Parts of her were not quite fitting in all the clothes that she had previously purchased. And so we had to have that very careful conversation in a caring way, and try to problem solve if there was someone in her family that might have some additional clothing that might work for her, but not from a punitive place of like, this is too, sexualized for work, for example, was one of the comments someone of the staff had made for this particular individual. Right, and also recognizing that dress has a cultural element, and so also being sensitive to and exploring, not that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, but exploring how that might work for that given individual with lots of caring. All right, bidirectional communication is our second strategy. So when I say bidirectional, I think it's sort of self-explanatory, but I first want to do some level setting. What does that mean to you? Bidirectional communication. Both sides communicate. Yep. And both sides are heard. Both sides are heard. Yeah. So it's not just the words that are coming out, but how they are being listened to without just preparing a response. Beautiful. So given that, right, Generation Z might want to communicate somewhat differently. We already heard an idea of like, Snapchat is not the way I'm going to communicate with my youth staff. So what are some systems, structures, or processes that you need to ensure that people can say what they need, but then are also heard, and their ideas at least can be really honored, if not like taken into action? What is needed in order for bidirectional communication to happen in the workplace? Yeah, so you said that being intentional and not just having a my door's open, come when you need me kind of thing, right? We've all had that friend of like, just tell me what you need and when you need it, versus like, and so I think of that, the difference between passive communication and active communication in that sense. Anything else that's needed for bidirectional communication to really be able to happen within a workplace? Yeah, so having multiple modes to connect with you. You always have these like multi-part, really juicy response. I love it. Having multiple modes of communication and identifying for that particular person which mode might work best for them. And then the second thing you said is having, and we'll talk actually about it, keyed it up beautifully, is natural mentors or another person within the organization with whom they might feel most comfortable speaking with. So that will be a separate category, but we will talk about it. Awesome. All right, so holding regular one-on-one supervision, so exactly that, right? So I meet with my youth staff more frequently than I meet perhaps with other staff because of the amount of support they might need to be able to achieve the particular activities or deliverables. But we meet, in this case, I meet with my youth staff weekly, and I meet with my other staff bi-weekly, or every other week. We also set meeting times that work for all. So I think that can be challenging if you're providing a service to the community, for example, caregiving. So you have to either do it before or after. But having an overt conversation with the folks you expect to attend that meeting to try to identify the time that is most likely to result in folks coming. Not that it can work for all. Rotate note-taking. So this piece, actually, my youth staff was like, every time they asked me to take the notes, like I was the secretary or something. And perhaps that is the role that you hired that young person for. But if it's not, then it can be important to make sure that everybody is taking on the responsibilities of keeping notes of that meeting. I've also found that if we have a shared note document, like something on Google Drive, if that's something you can use, is helpful because for me as a person, I forget things, and it's helpful to have it written down if we make an agreement or commit to something together. And then to the degree, again, to which it's possible is to co-create the agenda and allow folks a little bit of time to prepare. So I have one youth staff who is really contemplative and likes more time to prepare something. So if I tell him, we are going to invite you to share out for 20 minutes next meeting about the research you've been doing on X. That at least allows him to know that at the next meeting, I'm going to have 20 whole minutes. And, we might structure like how they're going to, work with that time, what additional support they may need to be able to share out at that meeting. Or you can also leave it open. Would you be ready next week, or do you need it a little bit more time? So just really having a little bit of flexibility. I hear there's lots of flexibility, which is really awesome and also hard. And yet it sounds like you're meeting the needs of your staff despite all the challenges. And then posting it ahead of time for me, again, is just about allowing everybody to have access to information. Because when I ask my staff to be like, respond now, sometimes their first thought is the best thought. But most often, when folks have a little bit of time, even if they might not look at it even 5 minutes before the meeting, they're more likely to come in with something substantive, big, that they've actually been able to think about. And then you already spoke to this, discuss, there's 2 C's there, and come to consensus on communication channels and timing expectations. So my staff know that I do not check my phone or my emails after 8 p.m. You cannot expect a response from me on Sunday. When I teach, it's the exact same thing. I tell my students, do not expect a response from me on Sunday afternoon or midnight. So just being clear and trying to describe why those parameters are in place. And I know many of my staff now have the notifications silenced on their own phones when they're resting or whatever they're doing with their families or friends. So I think it can be just an important sort of also skill building opportunity to create those boundaries within your life. Saying I don't communicate by Snapchat is totally fair. And maybe is there a staff person who, if that's the only way they want to communicate, is there someone else who might feel comfortable doing that? And if not, that's an acceptable standard to set within your organization. I do have a very hard time having young people respond to emails. They seem, unless it's in the subject line, that what you wanted them to do or say, it's challenging to get them to open up the emails. I also think it's important, at least for me, to make sure the staff know that when they are responding to things via email, that they either are or are not expected to return emails during non-work hours, right? Setting those expectations of or saying, I'm going to make sure that you have at least 1 hour where we're not, in the office /on for whatever job it is, where you can sort of have swinging time to respond to email every week that might be outside of traditional office hours. So if that is the expectation that they'll respond to you quickly, that you're compensating them fairly for that time where they might be checking email or making phone calls or responding to texts. All right, so I didn't want to offer all the scenarios. I wanted to see if anyone had a challenge that you've experienced or a success related to bidirectional communication. Something you've done well or a challenge you've encountered. So the challenge being that because we want to meet young people where they're at and we are serving young people with our organizations, we do things that we perceive may not be available to them in other work contexts. Communicating via multiple venues, via text and email. Any thoughts about that challenge? Yeah. So the recommendation was to build in an intentional check-in at the end of every day, or debrief. Is that what you call it, debrief? At the end of every day. So to be able to do sort of a roses and thorns, meaning something that was really great about your day, something that was a challenge from your day, and then being able to sort of have that moment to catch folks before they leave, this intentionally constructed time. That's a beautiful recommendation. I love it. Awesome. All right. We're going to do this one, and then we'll take a brief stretch break so that you can move just your bodies a little bit. All right, so instrumental scaffolding. This is perhaps the most technical or jargon type word, but really it means to think about something that you want to teach them or support them in learning. Teach them feels a little bit like power over, although we want to support them in learning something. Learning being many different ways to do that. That you're giving the support that they need throughout the learning process, and that over time, sort of the scaffolding is as they build and demonstrate the skills, that you're slowly sort of walking back the amount of support you provide. But in the beginning, this can be a lot of different kinds of support. And I think we already spoke about it a little bit of I sit beside them and I model the activity that I want them to be able to do. Right? Modeling can be a very powerful way of demonstrating how to complete a task. Using a template. So we're working with one of our young people who has done some interviews around the state around cannabis use. And our young person, after asking them, so I had to ask, have you ever written a report before? No. Okay. And what do you know? Have you read a report before? Yes. Okay. So I'm trying to learn what they know about this thing already. And then I'm okay, so let's work together and build out a little bit of a template or a visual organizer for you. So you feel like you can be successful, and we'll have intentional check-ins as you build out each part of this report. So I created a little outline basically that he would fill in, and I tried to get as explicit as possible because report could be a 1-page thing or it could be a 75, 100-page thing. And so I needed to really be clear on what expectations I had for the thing that he was developing. And then, as he wrote the background section, why is this project happening? I created some questions that he might respond to as he was designing it. How did you collect the information? Who did you ask? How did you ask? So just really breaking down these component steps, knowing that he had never written a report before. That obviously was sort of built upon the fact that he had done writing for our organization in the past. We have to acknowledge that the types of writing instruction that folks have is very different. And so the kinds of language arts classes or English classes one might have taken might be different depending on where they went to school or the kind of school they went to. And so I think written communication in the workplace has been sort of excellent oral and written communication. And we have to acknowledge the ways that having those standards is both important for communicating, but also can send a message that those folks who have a language other than English or who might not have had the same opportunities for explicit English instruction might be pushed away from that opportunity. So if your goal is diversity and equity, then you might need to provide additional support. We've done a couple role plays, and I don't do this in the formal, we're going to play now, but if the young person, we had a young person who wanted to give a presentation at a conference, but they had never given a presentation before. So first we allowed them, created the space so that they could do their presentation and give it to me. And then they gave their presentation to our staff. And then they gave their presentation at the conference. So they had multiple opportunities to practice, receive feedback on, and then do it in different contexts at increasing levels of challenge. But it's possible that you will be hiring young people who have lots of presentation experience. So you don't want to make assumptions about what they have done or what they haven't done, but really you get to know each individual young person, what they have done, what they are excited about, and build from there. Does anyone have any other examples of strategies that might be associated with instrumental scaffolding, which is just really big words for breaking something down into its parts? So you're saying, yeah, so first you teach it, then they see it? Is that?
They see it and then hands-on.
Hands-on. And then they do it. Okay. So really breaking it down and making sure they have multiple opportunities to see the same content, and with different levels of opportunity for them to have sort of influence. So I've sort of spoken about some of these things. Explore the knowledge and skills the person has and how they've used it. So again, not assuming in either direction. Even my staff who are older, who have never submitted paperwork to the university, for the very first time, I have to sort of break down those ideas. Where do you access the forms? Where do you find the information to be able to fill out the form? Who do you submit the form to, right? So even for all, I would say for all staff, it's important to figure out what knowledge they bring into the space and how that's been applied, and then meet them where they're at to be able to build the skill that they might need to complete the activity. And then the learning pedagogy talks about component parts of the process. So we talked a lot earlier about the, signing a form, right? Just really understanding that something that seems simple on its face, if you were working in an office and you had access to a printer, right, we might have to break it down into the parts in order for that person to be successful. And sometimes you don't know what those parts are, or that that has more steps than you might have expected. And that's when you can apologize and acknowledge that you can do better, and commit to helping them sort of work around and break down the parts of the project. I think for me, the apologizing is about the power dynamic that exists and the kinds of relationships I want to have with my youth staff and within all of my staff, is to acknowledge that I am a fallible human that is going to make mistakes, and that if I can, we think about the modeling situation, if I can model accountability for something I did or shouldn't have done, then I am modeling for them that this is a space where we can name that we've messed up, not taken something for granted. But I often do it first and more frequently in the beginning to model that this is the kind of space where we're all going to make mistakes, and we're all going to, trip up a little bit, and we can all come together and name it and move on. So I think for me, it's this intentional process to acknowledge that we're always doing new things all the time. And in doing that, by being brave and stepping into that, what I call comfort plus one space, that it is okay to make mistakes. And even me as the supervisor, I often make an assumption about what I thought you knew, or what I thought I described the report well enough that you should be able to do it. And yet I realize as I get, for example, I set one of our youth staff up to do some research on a photography method called photo voice. And I had made the assumption that because they had been gone to some level of undergraduate education, that they knew how to do research and document where they got their information. And then they gave me something back, and it was sort of just a Word document with things copied from the internet. And that wasn't what I expected at all. And I had to apologize that I didn't really set that person up for success. That I didn't describe that my expectation was that we had citations, that it was formatted in some way that someone could read it. So I think for me, it's to acknowledge where I took, or I made an assumption, or I did a misstep in a way that allows them to also learn and grow, they still had to fix the thing. But I had to acknowledge that I didn't do a good enough job of describing what I had intended for them to do.
Right, that's a good example.
Yeah. Lots of practical examples, hopefully. Any other questions or thoughts? And I agree, I probably apologize more, and it's also perhaps a function of being a female identified person, where I think I was socialized to apologize more frequently. But in my relationships with my staff, it has created a space where we are all going to make mistakes and we can apologize. Perhaps unintentionally, but it has been a function of that. We talked about modeling and regular check-ins for progress. So, right, if I ask that staff member, if we're talking about the report, to write the background section, I don't just wait till they've gone and done the whole report and then provide them feedback on whatever happened. I've learned the hard way that if I send them for a task and I do no check-ins, and a month later the task is due to whomever, and I didn't provide the support, then I have to deal with whatever we get in a month from now. And so it's just better for me to pay my future self and schedule regular check-ins to break down that task into meaningful, reasonable parts. So I might say, all right, so before now and Thursday, I'd like you to write the background section. It should be about 3 paragraphs long. And I'll meet with you on Thursday and we'll check in to see how that's going, if you could bring that with you. Right? So now I know that they haven't gone off and written the whole report and wasted my time and their time in developing something that wasn't quite what I wanted or needed, but that I'm providing that check-in more often in the beginning, right? This is all about, I call it pay your future self, of like, in the beginning, it takes a lot more time to bring on new staff. But over time, as the scaffolding, right? You pull away the scaffolding slowly, and then the building is there. But you have to be able to build it with all the staff members, regardless of age, actually. And then lots of opportunities to ask questions. I find that actually it's more likely that a staff would feel uncomfortable to ask questions. Like, I will be exposing that I don't know how to write a report or how to create a one-pager about photo voice. But we have to intentionally create the process and a space to ask the questions. So I love that debriefing at the end of the day might be like, what questions came up for you today that I could help answer? Like just that once a day check-in, or even once a month, or whenever you're meeting with folks, for whatever frequency. All right, I guess I sort of gave a lot about this scenario because it really happened. So you're meeting for supervision with your youth staff, and they share the report they created from interviews they just completed. The report does not include many of the details that your funder expects. We already talked a lot about this. So what do you think I should have done in this scenario? He said a template would have been handy in this case to really provide the details that I really knew that the funder needed. And unfortunately, I didn't know that the funder wanted these things. Should have asked those good questions. Sometimes that's, again, another place where I might apologize and say, I didn't find out enough about this thing before we did it. My bad. And you can learn to ask questions too. Awesome. This next one is called Natural Mentors. I think we've talked a bit about it, so I'm not going to spend as much time as we have on the other couple, because I really want to center on the equity and justice recommendation. But a natural mentor is a non-supervisor who can provide other forms of support based on the needs, interests, identities of the youth staff. And they provide different kinds of support based on the time that they may need to process through something, or somebody who has just most recently finished an activity, right? So if we're talking about a report, maybe another staff member might be able to do that scaffolding if you don't have the time. Or they more closely match the identities of the staff So when we think about this is for us, like as a white woman, the kinds of relationships I can have, and also because I'm a supervisor and submit, performance paperwork, they might want to have different conversations with staff who might hold similar identities to them. So I have 2 staff who identify as queer, and they meet regularly to sort of just meet with each other and provide different forms of support. So, natural mentors, making an expectation or norm that all members of the team provide support to one another. So we do some norm setting, which is outside of what's available in the handbook, but just talks through like, okay, so what are some agreements that we can have as a team that will enable us to show up fully? And one of those happens to be that we all support one another in different ways at different times for different reasons. And then this feels really relevant to y'all. I'm sure you do this, but engage in team building so that all members of the team have different kinds of relationships with one another. And I'm reminded of the importance, and I think this feels very natural for y'all because you're very used to it perhaps when you're providing services, but remembering to have events that are not centered around alcohol, or require that youth staff bring their own food or pay for something themselves, so that the team building actually is something that is accessible to all. So team building in a work-appropriate, non-work setting, that feels like, we've played Yahtzee together, very simple, or we've done, hung out in parks with our dogs, and as long as everyone is comfortable with that opportunity. We've gone on walks or hikes together. So we try to find ways to just sort of like be together as a staff in a sort of non-meeting setting. So I'm not going to offer a scenario for this because we do have some time constraints, but this one feels really critical to me. And so it's about equity and justice. So equity means that people get access to the resources that they need to succeed. And justice is really about transforming our systems so that equity can happen. Okay? So Generation Z is more aware of racism and, as I said, more accepting of gender as a fluid category. They are more open to talking about social issues than previous generations. And sometimes it's appropriate in the workplace, and sometimes it isn't. And so important to think about that. But what are some considerations y'all can think of as it relates to equity and youth staff? Does everyone have a computer? Yeah. Does everyone have a phone? Yeah. Having the materials that they'll need to be successful and safe. Yeah, so being aware of the way that your youth posting may communicate your values, and being sure that it's representing the way that you want it to be seen in communities, and recognize that that might be felt differently, right? If you have excellent oral and written in English, that might exclude certain groups, and that might have an impact on hiring in terms of like who you might attract to that position. Great. So I have lots on this slide. Sorry, there's 4 points I had to say. So I love that we have our youth staff here today because we want to make sure that professional development opportunities are available to all staff, right? So if it's just certain folks who get to attend, right, being really intentional about including folks, to include all the people. And so when I write my budget, it's about including funds for each member of my staff to attend the training that they may want to. And also that it's sort of, we have a goal setting part of the year where they have to set goals and then identify trainings that might be appropriate for reaching those goals. This is more just for youth generally, but we in our industries use lots of acronyms and we use lots of jargon or words that don't necessarily are not as relatable to the young people we want to partner with. So I work in the School of Medicine as well, and my goodness, they have so many acronyms. I'm lost. And so really spelling out those acronyms and then creating a space where someone can go at any point, and maybe even modeling it like, I don't know what ACGME is. What is Apple? Do you mean a true apple? And they're like, no, it's an acronym. So just really stepping back. And if you can, refrain from using acronyms or other sort of specific jargon in your work. I think this point just feels important that your budget communicates the value that you have for young people. So whether that's around the team building, really budgeting for that if you're able, or building towards a system where you can budget for team building, and just recognizing if you looked at your budget today, what would it communicate about what you value? Just an open-ended question. Create a space where ideas can be challenged without a person being offended. Create a plan for when ouch happens. So we talk a lot about the fact that each one of us only knows what we know. And that is informed by who we are as people and the experiences that we've had in this world. And that I have a lot of things that I don't know, and each one of us does as well. And so we try to create and speak openly about, well, what are we going to do as a team before it happens, ideally, if somebody says something that really hurts your feelings? What are we going to do with a team if someone has something called a microaggression, or something that harms you because of your identity or who you are, your race, your gender, your education level? So creating a plan about how you can restore or create more hope and healing before the event happens, ideally, but then also how to create and restore relationships when ouch does happen is also important to plan for. So I already told you a little bit about what happened. This is a real scenario, real life scenario. Your youth staff member had a difficult meeting with some partners in which the staff member experienced a microaggression, was misgendered, meaning they were perceived to be female and they were actually male. You are not at the meeting. Your youth staff doesn't want to go to the next meeting because they're really struggling. So we had a meeting and they didn't show up. And I'm like, why didn't you come? We all were going to that staff meeting. And they're like, the meeting before it was really tough and this is what happened. So this really did happen not that long ago. And I'd love your thoughts on what you would do as a result of this happening. So a couple different points there. One being starting a meeting with pronouns, gender pronouns, at every meeting, recognizing that one person's gender pronouns could change at any point. So being open and creating space for that, but also letting folks have the opportunity to not share if that, isn't something they want to express about themselves in that moment. And the other point was to create group norms or group agreements and really talk about the kinds of spaces you want to create and how everybody can show up as their authentic selves, but then how we can also assure some level of safety within our meetings. Great points. Yeah. So you were really talking about centering the person who is harmed in the situation and making sure you check in with them about what they need, not only in that very moment as they are pretty dysregulated or are hurt. They're considering, a lot of folks leave workspaces where this happens, right? And people who experience many microaggressions, they would say death by 1,000 cuts, right? They're just initially small cuts, but they add up over time. And so it is important to attend to these things and then center the person who is harmed. So in this instance, we had a meeting with this young person, and then we met with the person who was leading the meeting, and told them what had happened and that young person's experience. We reached out to the person who did the harm. This was all the things that the young person had agreed to. So we really said, what do you want? Because initially it's I don't want anything, it's fine, let's move on. And this young person really said, I want that person to do better. I don't want them to ever come again. Okay, so now we really have to commit to a community where we're supporting one another in a way that's really restorative. And so we're still in process. We're still having these restorative conversations and finding ways to support one another. Yeah. So actually going to your staff and allowing them to have some choice in how they're represented can be really important. And that's why when we do the pronouns conversation, it's also to say there are other options. You can use your name as a pronoun, or some other way that you want to be represented. And all of those are okay. Thank you for bringing that into the space as well. All right, last one, and then we're going to jump into the scenario. Reflection and action. And a scholar that I really love who talks about reflection is really about having that mirror. And reflection or reflexivity in sort of academic spaces is to examine your own feelings, reactions, and motives or reasons for acting, and how they influence the way you think or how you respond. So if I responded very strongly because of maybe past experiences, or I reacted in a way that sort of felt outsized to whatever happened, I can account for that and dig into why I responded the way I responded by myself. I don't need to do that in a public way. I could do that in a public way with my team if I felt like it was important to really unpack it as a group. If my reaction or my attitudes had an impact on everybody around me, I might unpack it as a team, depending on the relationships we had and the time. But I think reflection is not alone good enough to ensure that things don't happen again, is to really commit to action, right? We should be sort of in reflection and action cycles where we're reflecting on our behavior, our thoughts and our emotions, thinking about how we might do it differently next time, trying it next time, reflecting, did that seem to address it, and continually moving as a sort of a cycle of reflection and action. Why did I do that way? Wonder why. And it's important to just sit with myself, which can be uncomfortable. And also our world is it's very fast paced. So it's good to just sort of sit and provide silence. So what are some questions you could ask yourself or your team to engage in reflection? So saying that you're a processor and that you might get their response back in a day or two. Are there any final thoughts, or what are your takeaways? Yeah, what are the big parts, and having that as a regular space in your agenda? Great ideas. So I call this the pause and reflect, that anybody at any time in my staff can ask for a pause. Things feel heated, they're not sure if they're ready to talk. I just need a pause. Then I sort of check in how long that pause they would like it to be. Like, do we just want to stop this conversation right now? And then we'll return to it at a future meeting? Do you want a couple of minutes? Like, I need to know, like, as a facilitator of the space, like how long the pause they'd like it or need it to be. And then creating that sort of space. So in our staff meetings, we have two ways. One, anyone can call for a pause at any time. And two, we have a thing on our agenda of like what issues need to be addressed, what questions remain unsolved, and where can we dig deeper into equity is our third one. But that's because we are a social justice organization committed to equity. So we're like, how can we dig deeper today? Like, did we do it? Did we not? How are we doing it? Those sorts of things. So we have it on our agenda. Not every meeting do we get to it, to be honest, but we have it there, and it becomes more regular as a practice. And then I actually have a midpoint reflection. Really important with you staff to be doing reflection anonymously in whatever way you can. So we use Jamboard a lot, even in a staff meeting, because it's anonymous. So I say, something you want me to start doing, it's called start, stop, continue. Something you want me to start doing that I'm not currently doing that would support you. I don't have it up here, sorry. Something you want me to stop doing that's getting in your way of doing your work, it's harmful, or it's just not great. And something you think that I'm doing right now that you'd like me to continue doing. So we do that twice a year, our start, stop, continue process. Then again, there's regular spaces for individual and group level reflection, that we don't have to respond immediately when we get an email, that we can take a moment to reflect, or that we don't have to respond immediately in a meeting, that we can take time to reflect and think. So just really carving out the time for reflection. And then the final thing is to take concrete and specific action. So really, if it's not just about like, okay, so for example, our work is really social justice focused. We wanted to be serving all young people, and yet we found that in our work, that young people who have what's called neurodiversity, or young people who have ADHD, young people who are experiencing autism, that those young people were not being included well in our work. And we were sort of excluding them unintentionally because of our curriculum or ways we were talking or our big conferences. And so we really committed to doing better for those young people and hired everybody committed to training to how to better support young people with autism. And then we hired a special educator to work on our materials. So it's about like not only the reflection and identifying problems, but then committing to actions that you'll take as a result of them. Awesome. All right. So we only have about 25 minutes left, and I want to get into the scenarios. I'm going to hand you out your one-pager with all the strategies. And then what I will also do is hand out 2 different scenarios. We're just going to work on scenario 1 today. And on that, you can answer these questions. What concerns do you see in this scenario? What strategies might have been most useful to address or correct these concerns? And what actions might you take to prevent this from happening in the future? So we can work, in smallish groups. Maybe if folks want to move over and sort of join this table or that table over there, that way we'll have at least some smaller groupings. And we'll go ahead and take about 15 minutes to go ahead and read through this scenario and think through your response. We're not going to have, due to time, we're not going to have each group share out, but I was really interested in this conversation. I feel like we talked a lot, even just helping each other outside of this scenario. I do want to just leave a little bit of time for each of you to take out your notebooks that you were gifted, whatever color you prefer, and write 3 different actions that you intend to take. 1, what is one small shift you plan to take in the next week as a result of this workshop? So what is in the next 7 days, thinking about what we talked about here, whether it's something I said or another participant, what is one small shift you plan to take? In the next 30 days, what is a new practice that you'd like to try? Not saying it's gonna work, but what would you like to try to see how it goes? And then is there any, and maybe there's not, but in the next year, is there one policy that you plan to change to be able to integrate any of these ideas or suggestions from your colleagues? So what is a policy or practice within your setting you plan to change within the next year? And this will be your action plan, and I'll invite whoever go ahead and take about 6 minutes to write your action. If you need more time, I understand, but we have to wrap up and then we'll close. So we're gonna just do a whip around and have everyone share out one step they plan to take as a result of this training, and I will repeat it into the mic to cement it in video history forever. Working on acronyms, really great in policy. Thank you. Okay, really focusing in on meetings and having a rotating note taker and an agenda, maybe some space for reflection. Yeah, so adding these components to the youth onboarding, and then also really just normalizing these practices across the institution regardless of age. Thank you. Yeah, really helping prepare young people so that they can enter the workspace, like knowing that that's the expectation from employers in this community, pardon me. So putting out more reminders about the mandatory things. Great. That's really great. Consistency in the expectations, and then letting folks really know ahead of time if something has to change. Offering flexibility, but trying to be as consistent as is reasonable. Awesome. So one-on-one supervision. Great. Breaking activities down step by step and not just making assumptions that folks know a certain thing and what you want. Great. Asking for more information ahead of time so that you know how to be prepared for the meetings. Great. Helping your boss understand what works and doesn't work. I love it. Attending together. Yeah, so finding those natural mentors within your organization to connect the young people to, so that they have relationships with multiple folks, not just one. Awesome. Well, I want to just express so much gratitude for you all spending the last, several hours in this space to really support you staff. Your presence is an obvious commitment to serving young people and ensuring they continue on in the professions that you work in. And this is just a true indication of your desire to do the best that we can and meet whatever shows up. So if y'all want to get in contact with me, you can email me, you can text me, you can find me on Twitter. That's my, it's not my actual location, but that's my Twitter profile if you want to stay on things updated. And if you want to connect with me for whatever reason, I encourage you to do so. So knowing I won't text you back after 8 p.m. Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Have a great one.